Hello, Godfathers and Drug Lords, and welcome to another episode of Thug Analysis. I'm your gang enthusiast host, Esther Dotson. In today's episode, we will be diving into a cross-border showdown. We will be comparing American gangs and Mexican cartels. Specifically, we will be comparing the influence of the Bloods and Crips during the 1992 Rodney King riots in Los Angeles, California, to the Sinaloa cartel's bold display of force during the 2019 Battle of Culuchican in Culuchican, Mexico. Despite the causes of these events being extremely different, they both involve two non-state affiliated uprisings, two nations, and one big question. When the government loses control, who really runs the streets? Without further ado, let's get into it. In this first segment, I will be giving you a brief overview of the Bloods and Crips, their founding, their structure, and their rivalry. But before we go any further, let's take a moment to answer a simple question. What exactly is a gang? Despite how deeply gangs are woven into American pop culture, from movies and music to news and headlines, there is no universally agreed upon definition of what a gang is. Even law enforcement agencies differ in their definitions. However, for the purposes of today's episode, we will be referring to the most mutually agreed upon federal definition. According to the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security's Immigration and Customs, also known as ICE, a gang is defined as an association of three or more individuals who collectively identify themselves by adopting a group identity, such as a common name, slogan, symbol, tattoo, clothing style or color, hairstyle, hand sign, or graffiti, to create an atmosphere of fear or intimidation, with the purpose in part being to engage in criminal activity and using violence or intimidation to further its criminal objectives. Its members engage in criminal activity or juvenile delinquency to enhance or preserve the association's power, reputation, or economic resources. The association may have characteristics such as rules for joining and operating, recruiting meetings, providing physical protection, exercising control over geographic areas, defending against rivals, or having an identifiable structure. Okay, now that we've defined what a gang is, let's start with the Crips. The Crips were founded in 1969 by 15-year-old Raymond Washington. The Crips began as a community organization loosely modeled on the Black Panther Party. Raymond aimed to create a brotherhood that would protect against police brutality and racial oppression. But as the group expanded, especially after the uniting of Stanley Williams, also known as Tuki, it took a more violent turn. Tuki helped transform the Crips into a decentralized network of independent sets, each operating under the Crips identity. His leadership brought structure but also steered the gang towards violence and criminal activity, including drug dealing and turf wars, as a means to gain power and control. The Crips grew rapidly, especially in South Central Los Angeles, marked by blue bandanas, graffiti, hand signs, and a reputation for fear and respect. There was no central leadership, just a shared identity and culture. Under Tuki's influence, the Crips evolved into one of the most powerful and notorious gangs in Los Angeles by the early 70s. Now let's explore the Bloods' history. The Bloods emerged in 1972 as a direct response to Crip expansion. As the Crips gained dominance, smaller independent groups faced pressure to either join or be overtaken. In resistance, several of these gangs, including the Piru Street Boys, formed an alliance that eventually became the Bloods. Centered in Compton, the Piru Boys were known for their tight-knit community and determination to protect their turf. The Bloods adopted red as their identifying color and built a strong anti-Crip identity, symbolizing defiance and a fight for autonomy in a volatile environment. Structurally, Bloods mirrored the Crips, as they were decentralized groups of sets with their own leadership and territory. This made them highly adaptable, but also prone to internal conflict. The Blood and Crips rivalry was less about colors and more about control over territory, influence in the city's criminal economy, and survival in a violent landscape. This conflict fueled a cycle of retaliation that would last for decades. By the 1980s, the crack epidemic had infested everything. Both gangs had capitalized on the drug trade, expanding their influence and wealth, but also attracting aggressive policies, which contributed to mass incarceration in Black communities. With militarized police forces and increasingly armed gangs, the Crips and Bloods became an enduring symbol of violence and systematic neglect, ever present within the Los Angeles area. In this next segment, I will give a brief overview of the 1992 Rodney King riots, as well as the Bloods and Crips' influence throughout the tragedy. On April 29th, 1992, 4 LAPD officers, 3 of them being white and 1 of them being Hispanic, were acquitted in the brutal beating of Rodney King, despite clear video evidence showing them beating him repeatedly. The verdict outraged Black and brown communities, who were already burdened by decades of police brutality and systematic racism. The response was immediate. Chaos erupted at Florence and Normandy as violence spread across South Central LA, with the LAPD retreating. The streets descended into 6 days of fire and looting. Over 1,000 buildings were burned. While some were protesting an injustice, others, especially those who were gang affiliated, took advantage of the unrest. Bloods and Crips played extremely complex roles throughout the duration of the riots. In some neighborhoods, they protected local businesses and residents, setting up barricades and patrolling streets, although these moments were extremely rare. Yet others contributed to the destruction, settling scores and looting rival-owned stores, or those seen as tied to police. For some, it became less about injustice and more about retribution and opportunity. Liquor stores, pawn shops, electronic shops, and Korean-owned businesses were especially targeted. The Bloods and Crips' involvement in the 1992 Rodney King riots blurred the line between rebellion and opportunism. For many, it was payback against a system that had failed them, but others later regretted the lasting damage to their own neighborhoods. Many of the businesses that were burnt down were never rebuilt, and it only deepened the existing poverty in the area. Before all the chaos of the riots took place, the Watts Truce was signed between the Bloods and Crips, and it offered a brief glimpse of unity. Bloods and Crips in areas like Jordan Downs and Nickerson Gardens met publicly, shook hands, and organized peace walks. But these efforts were extremely overshadowed by the scale of the destruction committed by other gang members. By May 4th, federal troops and over 10,000 National Guard soldiers had restored order in the city. Over 60 people had died, thousands were injured, and entire communities were left in ruins. The gangs emerged from the riots with a taste of both power and loss, momentarily stepping into the vacuum of authority, but this was at a great cost to their own communities. In this next segment, I will give a brief overview of the history of the Sinaloa Mexican cartel. But first, let's define our terms. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, drug cartels are large, highly sophisticated organizations composed of multiple DTOs and cells, handling tasks like drug transportation, enforcement, and money laundering. While their command structures are typically based outside the U.S., they operate domestically through aligned DTOs, also known as drug trafficking organizations, with strict hierarchies managing the production and distribution of illicit drugs. With that in mind, let's talk about the Sinaloa cartel, one of the world's most powerful and enduring drug cartels. The Sinaloa cartel originated in the mountainous state of Sinaloa in the late 1980s. Rising from the collapse of the Guadalajara cartel following the murder of DEA agent Enrique Camarena. That crackdown fractured the old cartel, spawning new ones, among them being the Sinaloa. Key founders included Joaquin Guzman, also known as El Chapo, Hector Luis Palma Salazar, and Ismael Zambada, also known as El Mayo. The Sinaloa cartel operates with a decentralized yet coordinated structure, more like a federation of allied cells than a rigid hierarchy. Each cell handles different tasks such as production, smuggling, security, laundering, making the organization highly resilient to law enforcement pressure. Even after El Chapo's capture and extradition to the US, the cartel remained active under El Mayo and other lieutenants. The cartel's reach is global. The cartel controls major drug routes from South America through Mexico and into the US, trafficking cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, marijuana, and increasingly fentanyl. It partners with criminal networks across the Americas, Europe, and Asia, and holds sway over key border zones and ports through violence, bribery, and deep infiltration of local institutions. Despite repeated efforts from the US and Mexican authorities to dismantle it, the Sinaloa cartel has proven remarkably adaptive. Its influence stretches far beyond drug trafficking, touching politics, economics, and public health. From the opioid crisis in the US to destabilized communities in Mexico. In this next segment, I will give a brief overview of the events of the Battle of Caluchican, which occurred in 2019. The Sinaloa cartel's power isn't just built on drug routes, it's enforced through military-style force. A clear example came on October 17, 2019, during what is now called the Battle of Caluchican. A direct confrontation between the Mexican government and the cartel that exposed just how limited a state's power can be. It began when Mexican federal forces captured Oldivo Guzman Lopez, the son of Joaquin Guzman, in Caluchican, Mexico, one of the cartel's strongholds. Oldivo Guzman, also known as El Raton, was a rising member in the organization after his father was sent to the United States. His arrest was meant to signal a win for President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Instead, it triggered a war. Within minutes, hundreds of armed cartel members launched a coordinated assault, blocking roads, torching vehicles, surrounding military bases, and threatening soldiers' families. Using a .5 caliber rifles, belt-fed machine guns, and armored vehicles, they overwhelmed security forces in broad daylight. The speed and precision of the response stunned the world. Videos showed streets ablaze and citizens fleeing as cartel's fighters moved openly with military-grade weapons. In one bold move, they even took soldiers hostage to force the government's hand. Faced with escalating chaos and the risk of mass civilian casualties, President López Obrador ordered Guzman's release. The government framed it as a humanitarian decision, but many saw it as a cop-out and proof that in some regions, cartels hold more power than the state. For the Sinaloa cartel, it wasn't just about freeing a leader, it was about asserting dominance, and the message was clear. Any attack on them would be met with overwhelming force. Their control wasn't limited to trafficking, it extended to politics, territory, and public fear. Today, the Battle of Caluchican remains one of the clearest demonstrations of cartel power, not just as a criminal enterprise, but as a paramilitary force capable of challenging a nation head-on. This now brings us to our second to last segment, where we will be comparing the Battle of Caluchican to the 1992 riots. When comparing the Battle of Caluchican to the 1992 LA riots, the most striking similarity is how both events saw non-state actors, whether gangs or cartels, seize power from formal authorities. However, their origins, strategies, and messages differed significantly. The 1992 LA riots erupted after the acquittal of 4 LAPD officers in the beating of Rodney King, What followed was a violent explosion of rage and chaos. Gangs like the Bloods and Crips, typically rivals, formed temporary truces to exploit the lawlessness. They looted, burned businesses, and seized control of blocks where police had retreated. Though the riots had began as a call for justice, gang-driven actions turned it into a struggle for power. This left entire neighborhoods economically and socially devastated. In contrast, the Battle of Coluchican was not a protest. It was a military display of cartel power. After Mexican forces captured Guzman, the Sinaloa cartel launched a coordinated assault, blockades, shootouts, and hostage-takings. The cartel's goal was singular: force the government to surrender, and it worked. The Mexican government released Guzman to avoid more bloodshed, sending shockwaves across the globe. While the LA riots reflected community anger spiraling into gang opportunism, the Coluchican conflict showcased a cartel acting as a shadow government. They didn't just exploit a power vacuum, they overpowered the state, dictating the outcome and exposing the cartel's deep-rooted influence in Sinaloa. The human cost of these events differs sharply. In the 1992 LA riots, there were 63 deaths and over 2,000 injuries, and nearly $1 billion worth of damages. The Battle of Coluchican saw 13 deaths, but its message was much larger. It showcased that in parts of Mexico, cartels hold power that rivals or even supersedes the state. These events show how different nations grapple with the challenges to authority. The LA riots exposed deep-rooted racial injustice and the fragility of social order. In contrast, the Coluchican siege revealed a crisis of control, where the government wasn't just mistrusted, it was outgunned. This brings us to our last segment, where I will go over the concluding questions. Now that we have walked through two critical moments, the 1992 LA riots and the Battle of Coluchican, each shaped by unique pressures, but both exposing the fragile balance between authority and chaos, what do these events tell us about the world we live in? They show that when institutions fail, whether due to injustice, corruption, or loss of control, other forces will step in. Sometimes those forces can claim to represent the people, sometimes they claim power or profit, but in every case, it's everyday citizens who bear the brunt, through loss of life, destroyed communities, and generational trauma. So, ask yourself, what happens when gangs or cartels can overpower governments? What does justice look like when violence manipulates it? Whether in the name of protest or profit? And most importantly, how do we rebuild trust in authority and peace when they've been repeatedly broken? Again, I would like to thank you for joining me on another episode of Thug Analysis. I've been your host, Esther Dotson. Make sure to come back next time for more thought-provoking questions about subjects you probably wouldn't normally think about. Remember to stay tuned, and that there's always more to a story.